Testing. Oh, there we go. Great. Yes.
Check, 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 check. Yeah. No, I think it's coming out.
Check, check.
Yeah. Doesn't say anything weird about me, does it? Oh yeah, yeah.
Should we do that right at the beginning? Okay.
Yeah. I can't be without my phone, which is ridiculous. No, I know. I know. It's fine.
You have your watch, right? Doesn't that tell you if something bad happens?
Hi.
Hi, do you what you need? The nice dinner? Yeah, yeah. It's so busy because there's a show at the Met. Yeah, and so we ended up at St. Luke's, which was great, but wow.
Clear? I think so. Yeah.
I find these chairs are like
I,
weirdly awkward.
yeah.
Everything is awkward.
I know.
Everything is awkward when you're in a weird conversation with two good friends and an audience.
I know. Just look at me, I'll talk in quiet tones.
Nothing about it. It's not awkward. It's all good.
There's this sports, whatever. My kids watch a lot of sports, and so in between like innings of this baseball, whatever stuff, they go to these announcers, and there's this one woman who always just stands, and it's so awkward. She's always like standing, like in this sort of position, and just like talking. I'm like, this is like so weird, and like it's this whole big open space. I'm like, can't they figure out like a better situation for her, like a desk or something? But I think it's like to show her legs, basically.
Wish we could still smoke.
Right,
It would be like,
right, like that was like
Do something with your hands.
like they do. I know. That is why people did it. You can pretend.
Yeah.
That's
nothing
not
awkward
weird.
about that.
That's weird. It's totally fine.
Like
Can everybody hear me?
cigarettes.
Hello?
Like the movie
This works.
cigarettes
There
that
you
they
go.
use.
Good evening. I'm John Broder, and I'm Rodef Shalom's congregation president. I want to welcome you to Rodef Shalom. For those who have been here many times or not before, it's wonderful to have you here. And we're very excited about kicking off our second year of our speakers program, Broad Perspectives, that we do in partnership with the Feinstein Center for the American Jewish History at Temple University. And if those of you who aren't familiar with it, you can sort of get the pun on broad perspectives and broad streets. We're at both ends. So before we do anything at Road of Shalom, when we're in a group like this, we want to make sure we're in community and get to know each other. So find somebody you haven't met before and introduce yourself. And we have a prompt for you to use in keeping with tonight's theme. So here you go. When you share your name, also share your plan for voting this year. What's your plan?
You voted already?
No, me neither.
I really like the
You gotta vote on the day.
We were talking about that earlier. I feel like my mic's on.
Oh, you're on.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't talk really.
I'm just gonna have to do this.
You gotta smile. Be charming.
I like debating whether I was gonna vote early on Saturday or not. I don't know.
Yeah, I love voting on the day.
Me too.
I feel like it will also be like a place to put the energy.
Yeah, I hope.
Yeah. If I get a really hard question, can I throw it to you? That'd be great. Thank you. Really the-
Happy to do it.
I got a doozy on Friday night at Pull on Me where you're speaking with
Oh.
Sharpton.
Oh yeah, they haven't confirmed that I'm doing it with Sharpton. Did they confirm for you?
They did.
Oh, that's funny.
In fact, the whole community.
Oh, that's funny. No one has told me.
Somebody asked, they're like amazing. Like, I mean, let's name the elephant in the room. We need to put Harris in the White House. You know,
Yeah.
long disposition. Rabbis looking at me like. And I just smiled, paused for a beat, and said, "Next question." It's like everybody's like,
Oh, okay.
I gotta tell you, like, if you go to a black church, they tell you who they're voting for. You think the IRS is kind of like, it's all part of these weird fictions.
Thank you.
I mean, I get it, kind of, you know, like I do get it, but it's like, if you
Also,
hear
like, yeah.
about it, it's like,
You know, well, it's like the same thing with safe theories, right? Like, I'm not going to say vote for this person, but we can say Trump is engaging in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories.
Okay,
And I
let's
will.
come back together. Hello, 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 hello. I know. This is a very chatty crowd.
well thought out.
We do this before all of our services too, and try to get everybody back in the pew.
Okay, good. You quieted yourselves down. I'm impressed. So anyway, let's get on with our program, American Jews and Democracy, a conversation about civic participation in polarizing times. So I wanted to introduce our speakers. So Aaron Dorfman, right here to my left, is the founder and executive director of A More Perfect Union, the Jewish Partnership for Democracy, an effort to mobilize the American Jewish community to protect and strengthen American democracy. Previously, Aaron served as president of Lippman Canfer Foundation for Living Torah, vice president for programs of American Jewish World Service, and director of informal education at Temple Isaiah of Contra Costa County. He serves on the advisory board of the Safety Respect Equity Network and was a founding board member of Repair the World. Aaron and his wife Talia live in Brooklyn, New York, where they're raising 3 fierce feminist daughters and 1 bearded dragon. Excellent.
Bearded Dragon always has to make an appearance.
Okay. And then we've got Amy Spitolnik. Amy is the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, the national convener of Jewish coalitions, working across communities to build a just and inclusive American democracy. She previously served as executive director of Integrity First for America, which won its groundbreaking lawsuit against the neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the Charlottesville violence. Amy recently authored a report on the intersections of anti-Semitism and democracy. She serves as a senior advisor on extremism to human rights first, on the advisory board of American University's Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, and on Bedrock's National Leadership Council. Sounds like you're a real extremist. Sorry. She also has extensive experience in government, politics, and advocacy, including as communications director and senior policy advisor to the New York Attorney General and spokesperson and advisor to the New York City Mayor, which I'm sure is a challenge these days. Finally, Professor Lila Corwin-Berman holds the Murray Friedman Chair of American Jewish History at Temple University, where she directs the Feinstein Center for American Jewish History. She's the author of several books on American Jewish politics and is finishing a new book on the 20th century history of American Jews and citizenship rights. Finally, I wanted to thank the Alfred and Helen O. Sellers Lecture Fund, who's making this talk possible tonight. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. As always, it is wonderful to be here. This feels like a home. It feels like an extension of our campus at Temple. And I am really, really excited for this conversation tonight because I am treating it as a form of personal therapy for myself. I don't know if everyone realizes that, but we are in these weeks, and I'm sure people are experiencing them in a myriad of ways. And what I value about Amy and Aaron is tonight you're going to hear a particular argument. You're going to hear a particular claim about what democracy means, not just as an abstraction, but democracy as a value for American Jews. And I'm really excited to have them share that with you because to me it was simply revelatory to read their work on it, to hear their speaking about this topic. And I really think it is invigorating in all sorts of ways. And for me, anyway, it was so much of the wisdom that is going to, I think, help me encounter whatever is to come. So we just heard formal introductions about each of you, but I would love for you to share briefly with our community here where you come from to these issues, right? Like, what is your position? How are you encountering this moment, right? A moment before we always use the word unprecedented. Every election, it seems, is more and more unprecedented than the last. A moment of electoral politics and also the questions of anti-Semitism and democracy that we're going to be talking about. So do you want to
Me?
start,
Sure.
Amy? Yeah.
Well, first, thanks so much for having me to Rabbi Mader and the whole Road of Shalom community. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really grateful to both of you for this conversation. Look, for me, at the core of all of this work is sort of a two-way recognition. We can't protect inclusive democracy and ensure the rights and safety of any community if we're not fundamentally countering increasingly normalized and rising anti-Semitism, and so too will Jews never be safe unless we are working to advance inclusive democracy in which each and every community is safe. We know that this has been, and as we'll talk about tonight, the place where really we as a Jewish community has found safety. My own family history is one in which my grandparents survived the Holocaust. The rest of their families were not as fortunate, and they came here after the war in search of a better life for their families. My grandmother was a seamstress. My grandfather drove a taxi in New York City. They raised my mom, who became a New York City public school teacher. And I remember growing up in New York on Long Island thinking how fortunate I was compared to my grandparents' generation to live in this country at a time where Jews were safe, where we didn't have to worry about anti-Semitism and hate in the way that my grandparents' stories really illustrated and that had been so seared into my brain. And in the last decade, something has shifted. And we all know it, right? I think as Jews, we know it in our guts, in our kishkas. We could feel this happening. For me, one of the first moments was in 2016, immediately after the election. There was a swastika drawn on the local playground in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. And thankfully, there was a massive effort by local elected officials and community members to come out against it. It could have been, we don't know who did it. It could have been a kid who just simply saw some hate on TV. But the fact that something like that had happened in Brooklyn, right, this place where my parents were born, that I was now living and making life. And then, of course, the following summer, when Charlottesville happened, those images of Nazis with torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us, Sieg Heil," and attacking both the Jewish and Black communities in Charlottesville, for me, that really ripped off the Band-Aid in a way that made clear, I think, the safety and the stability that I had always believed was real for me as a white Jewish American was no longer necessarily real here. And we've seen that go from the fringes to the mainstream over the last 7-8 years, where these conspiracy theories have become so normalized in our politics, from the invasion and replacement rhetoric to increasingly the overt anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant, racist, and other bigotry. And of course, post-October 7th, that has been compounded and become even more painful in new ways because it's happening in different directions now in a way that I think really wasn't necessarily as overt before the last year. And so it's easy to feel really isolated and alone right now and put up walls and to say that the only path forward is one in which we are going to sort of circle the wagons and isolate ourselves. And I need to keep reminding myself that the only thing we can do is come back to this framework, that understanding we as Jews will never be safe unless we are protecting and advancing the sorts of inclusive democracies that have kept us safe in this country. And so too, does that require Jewish safety for those democracies to succeed?
Love that answer. I also want to echo Amy's thanks to all of you for inviting us and hosting us for this conversation this evening. I'm also going to talk about my family. My parents were married a year to the day after Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis. My dad grew up Jewish and affluent in Long Island. My mom grew up Episcopalian and poor in northern Minnesota in a town of 200 people. And they both kind of heard Dr. King's call for civil rights and justice and made their way to Western Kentucky, which is as far as you can get from Roslyn, New York, it turns out. And met each other and did civil rights work there in the late 1960s. And probably would have stayed had it not been for their civil rights work sort of catching the attention of the Ku Klux Klan and making it clear that they were no longer welcome. So I feel like I've never been as sanguine about the risks to Jews in this country, the risks of anti-Semitism. But I think their wedding of their Jewish identities and their commitments to civil rights and their commitments to American democracy deeply informed my kind of lifelong trajectory. And how I get to democracy as an issue that American Jews need to focus on is that I care about lots of stuff. I care about reproductive rights, and I care about climate change, and I care about the safety and security of the state of Israel and national self-determination for the Palestinians. I care about healthcare and education. I care about LGBTQ rights. I care about all those things. And it's very clear to me that my ability to advocate for and pursue the things that I care about, which I imagine many of you share, and I imagine there are things that values that you have and positions that you hold that are different from mine. That's good. That's part of what makes like a great country, is that tension. But our collective ability to pursue those things, to pursue what we believe to be the good and the just, is only possible safely in a democracy, a functioning democracy. Because in the alternative, what allows us to exercise our beliefs is power. And that's not good for humans. It's definitely not good for Jews. So I'm in this work on democracy in order to ensure that we still have the enabling environment to allow us to pursue all the things that we care about as Jews and as Americans in relative safety and security.
So I'm going to do something super risky because I'm not a rabbi and I'm probably not as Jewishly educated about rabbinics or the Talmud as some people in this room. But there's, I think, a part of the Talmud that says that when Jews are living in whatever country or state that they're living in, that they have an obligation to pay attention to the laws of that country or that state, and that itself is, am I getting this right, guys? Yeah, okay. So that itself is actually a kind of obligation on Jews, right? And what I want to learn from you is I hear you making a very specific case that democracy is a form of government that Jews should be uniquely committed to, and that is really maybe the only form of government that we can feel some sense of security about Jews' ability to really thrive under. And I wonder about a certain kind of tension, right? Because I hear from the rabbis this sort of wisdom that whatever kind of system of government you're living in, you should adhere to that, and wherever it goes, you adhere to that, and that doesn't preclude you also doing whatever you're doing as a Jewish person. And there are even times when, if there are some tensions between them, the rabbis have a lot to say about how you're to navigate them. So I want to learn a little bit more about how both of you and your organizations really understand why Jews in the United States should have a particular commitment to democracy, especially at a moment when at least some forces in this country seem to be moving us away from democracy.
So I appreciate the risk. I will say that when we launched A More Perfect Union, which is only 3 years old, we're like the new kids on the block, or in sync. No, okay, it's okay. Sorry.
I appreciate it.
No, it wasn't really worth the laugh. Sorry, that might happen again. I apologize in advance. When we launched A More Perfect Union, we made a really intentional choice not to ground our claims about American democracy in Jewish text and tradition. And the reason we did that was because we are pretty clear that democracy is good for Jews, whether they're Orthodox or secular, Republicans or Democrats. Like, all the different kinds of Jews are protected by the umbrella or the enabling environment or the container that American democracy provides. And if you ask conservative Republican Jews, like, what Jewish values animate their commitments to democracy, and you ask progressive secular Jews, I'm making some broad generalizations, they tend to invoke different values. And we didn't want to kind of go down that path of grounding our claims in Jewish tradition and values. We wanted to ground it in a historical analysis. So we tend not to go to Dina de Malchuta Dina, right, to the law of the land is the law as the basis for our claims about American democracy. Instead, we look at the history, right? At the time that the United States was founded, Jews had experienced nearly 2,000 years of statelessness. We had been expelled from many countries. In the countries where we were tolerated, we were relegated to second-class status. We couldn't own land. We were taxed for being Jews. We were often persecuted in all different kinds of ways, forced into professions that were disparaged, like money lending. And the United States provided a radical break from that. In the founding documents of the United States and the Constitution, even before the First Amendment, right, even before religious separation of church and state and freedom of religious practice, there's Article 6 in the Constitution, which stipulates that no religious test shall ever be required of someone running for public office or serving in public office in this country. So from the very beginning, baked into the DNA of this country was an invitation to Jews to be part of the creation of a country. And at the time, I mean, now we're maybe 2%. At the time, we were no percent. But we were welcomed along with everyone else in the creation of this country. And that kind of protection, I think, makes American democracy, particularly, but democracy in general, a unique enabling environment for thriving Jewish life. I have a couple of things to say about it, but I want to hear from Amy.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with all of that. And I think sort of maybe to bring it into this moment, right? You spoke about why Jews have found the most safety we've had historically here in the United States at a time when, my phone's gonna fall, it's fine. Hopefully nothing will happen in the world while we're talking here. At a time when democratic norms and values and the rule of law are being eroded, we are also seeing how the erosion of democracy really creates the conditions for anti-Semitism to flourish, right? And so it's easy to understand anti-Semitism. It's easy to understand attacks on Jews as a form of prejudice, racial, religious, ethnic bigotry, hating us because of who we are, what we look like, how we practice or don't practice our religion, or any of the other ways most other minority communities tend to be targeted. What tends to be unique about anti-Semitism is that it also operates as this sort of insidious, pernicious conspiracy theory rooted in lies and tropes about Jewish control and power. And that is fundamentally how democracy and anti-Semitism are so intertwined, right? We hear this in the conspiracy theories related to the election being stolen by some shadowy globalist cabal that is bringing immigrants up from the southern border to vote in our election, or supporting the black community in illegal votes, or Jews will not replace us, right? An effort to replace the white race. We hear it in a lot of the post-October 7th conspiracy theories related to Zionist control and power, or Jewish or Israeli control and power, that cross the line from legitimate criticism of Israeli policy into more overt anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And so just as anti-Semitism is used to undermine our democracy, so too as our democratic norms and values fall apart and any community is under threat, it creates the conditions, it erodes the trust in our institutions to make anti-Semitism further thrive in a way that makes it more appealing, more palatable, more understandable to the average person. And so we're in this constant feedback loop. Anti-Semitism is used to undercut our democracy by sowing this distrust in our institutions, our election system, our government, and so on. And so too are we as Jews inherently made unsafe as those institutions and rule of law and democracy are targeted.
You got a soundtrack. Okay, so I want to kind of like dig into this a little more in this kind of particular moment, right? So lots of indicators tell us that we're at a precarious time, right? When there are many different forces that are at least, endangering our democracy, right? If not worse. And I want to understand how your organizations are thinking about those forces and are thinking about what people who are Jewish should be, how they should be responding to them, how they should be encountering these kinds of forces, right? So is there a particular way that, you have identified, whether it's conspiracy, whether it's a kind of rhetoric, whatever it might be, that you think, should really kind of occupy a lot of attention, especially among American Jews, when it comes to responding and making democracy more robust?
I can start and then I'll pass it to you. Well, I touched on some of this, right? I think it was easier, although still hard for certain people to understand, this sort of anti-democratic, anti-Semitic extremism when it was a Nazi with a torch in Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us," or as we're coming up on the anniversary of the Tree of Life attack, a white supremacist orchestrating the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in US history, right? Rooted in some of these conspiracy theories, the Great Replacement Theory, this idea that Jews are seeking to replace the white race with black and brown people, immigrants, refugees, and others. Still hard for the average person to understand, but a lot more overt. What we've seen become normalized in the years since are these very same conspiracy theories, but in slightly more palatable language about an invasion, about replacement, about an effort, a cabal, a globalist effort to steal the election, to replace our electorate. And of course, as I mentioned, post-October 7th, some of these very same tropes can show up across the political spectrum, and frankly removed from the political spectrum in some of the conversations. They're not manifesting in the same way, and it's important to be clear that on the right, we've seen it become increasingly violent, increasingly, particularly resulting in acts of mass violence. And on the left, what we've really seen are efforts to basically separate and divide Jews from the very coalitions and spaces we need to be in fact, to protect our democracy. Saying that Jews or Zionists are not welcome in certain spaces, whether it is on campus, whether it's in literary or academic or artistic spaces. And we can sort of dive into and unpack some of that, I'm sure, over the course of this conversation. But ultimately, sort of understanding how things that perhaps at one point felt more overt to us have been increasingly normalized and recycled in the political rhetoric that we're hearing from politicians who are espousing this invasion and replacement rhetoric, from those who are trying to effectively pit the Jewish community against others from all different directions right now, are playing into that very anti-Semitism that we're talking about here. And it's harder and harder for us to hear it, because part of the goal of extremism is to desensitize us to this. And in fact, in our Charlottesville lawsuit, we brought this lawsuit against the neo-Nazis who attacked Charlottesville, and during this 4-week trial, the neo-Nazi defendants explicitly used Holocaust jokes. They used the N-word. They engaged in really vile anti-Semitic, racist, and bigoted language. And one of their lawyers said very proudly to the press, "We are doing this to try to desensitize the jury." And we are now living at a moment where it's not just a jury in a trial of Nazis who extremists are trying to desensitize to hate. We are hearing it all day, every day in our political rhetoric, on social media, from elected officials, from candidates, from pundits on TV. And we need to understand that this is a deliberate tactic to normalize this extremism and make us feel like we are isolated and alone.
I'm going to layer something on that for you.
Oh, good.
Because both of you and your organizations, as the synagogue, have 501c3 status. And as we were walking in, I saw somebody being asked to put a sign aside that, wouldn't be appropriate in a place that's not telling people who to vote for, which I understand. And we're having this conversation, and there's a level of abstraction because there's this kind of commitment, sort of because the IRS tells us so. We could talk about why, but to being nonpartisan. And I'm wondering how in this moment, and I'll start with you, Aaron, and Amy, you might want to chime in too. Does it make sense to approach this as a nonpartisan issue? And what does that mean? I mean, we have an election coming up. People are going to vote for a candidate. We're talking about how these threats to democracy are layered in with anti-Semitism. And we may be saying we can see it in various places on the political spectrum, but when it comes to the politicians who are espousing it, it may be more clear from some than others. So I'm curious about how you think about that kind of nonpartisan label.
I think we have to hold it. I think part of, I was saying a minute ago about how we structure our organization and our appeal to both people on the Jewish right and people on the Jewish left. And that's not only a reflection of the fact that there are Jews on the right and on the left, and they need democracy in order to be safe. It's also reflective of like a century's worth of scholarship that tells us that democracies facing real precarity are much more durable and resilient if there are partnerships across ideological lines, right? If you look at France in the 1930s, when the French right kind of stormed to power, the extreme right and the sort of center right ignored it and let it happen. France was like, all of the people who were part of the extreme right in France later staffed the Vichy government under the Nazis. And if you look at Spain in the early 1980s, after Franco had died and was off the scene, the Spanish right, kind of the extreme right, surged up against democracy in Spain, and the center-right parties, including the king, resisted them. And they did that partially because their political opponents, the left in both cases, in the case of the Spanish right, like got their backs. They didn't kind of cast them all in with the extremists. So there's a pragmatic and strategic value, I think, to holding to the nonpartisan claim, to like leaning into it hard, because I think both from a pragmatic standpoint and also, frankly, because like the other people aren't going anywhere. Right, I think we've gotten into this place of purity on both the left and the right that we imagine that if we expel the people we disagree with, they disappear, right? Like the Israelis imagine that the Palestinians might just disappear, and the Palestinians imagine the same thing about the Israelis. And the 81 million people who voted for Biden really hoped in 2020, really hoped that the 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump would disappear, but they don't. Like we're stuck with each other. So we have to figure out how to navigate that, and I think like holding to a language that is about principles and democratic norms and institutions instead of like falling into the trap of partisanship, I think is really, it's an essential both philosophical and pragmatic strategy.
So I know you have things to say with that, but I'm going to do the same thing and layer in another piece to that, which is that one of the things Aaron is telling us, I think, is that pragmatically and maybe values-based, we need to work in coalition with people who are not always going to see eye to eye with us on every single issue, right? And that's what we might call a civil society. And that's actually a sort of bedrock of a democracy. We are in a moment when coalition in the Jewish community is incredibly vexed because of what's going on in Israel, what's going on in Gaza, what's going on in Lebanon, what might be going on more and more in Iran, right? And these issues in particular have been really making the kind of practice of coalition very, very difficult, not to mention some of the other kinds of partisan issues as well. And so I'm wondering if in kind of thinking about partisanship, you can also sort of bring into the discussion how it is that we keep a commitment to democracy, which I think relies on coalition, at a moment when there are many Jewish actors who seem to be indicating that there are certain coalitions you may not have.
Look, 100%. This is the challenge right now, and I will say I started my role at JCPA about a month before October 7th, and JCPA is an 80-year-old organization that was founded specifically to build cross-community coalitions, the Jewish community in coalition with others, fundamentally recognizing that our safety is in solidarity with others, that our futures and our safety are inextricably linked. We were founded in the dark days of World War II and the Holocaust at a time when Jews were fighting here to let more Jews into the United States, to fight for Jewish safety, and didn't necessarily have the power or the partners or the allies that we needed. And that was the impetus for JCPA, originally called NACRAC, to exist and mobilize Jews for the March on Washington, co-founded the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, mobilized for Soviet Jewry. The long history of JCPA is rooted in this recognition. And so to start this job and then a month later see October 7th happen, not just the deep pain and grief that I felt as someone, as a Jew, as someone who once lived in Israel, who has deep connections to people and the people on both sides of the conflict, frankly, and the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, but also then this immediate sort of reaction here at home, both the deep pain from seeing the overt anti-Semitism, the rally in Times Square with, swastikas and other stuff on October 8th, and also ultimately within just days, some in my own community saying, you gotta walk away from the racial justice work. You have to walk away from the social justice work. We can't be in these coalitions anymore. And none of that is gonna make us safer, right? We need to be able, and my friend Eric Ward talks often about how we build the muscle to stay at the table. And we need to do that while also having very clear red lines about what is not acceptable. And so to go back to sort of maybe the original question about what's partisan or not, right? It can't be considered partisan to call out anti-Semitism wherever it exists, whether it is democratic socialists in Times Square on October 8th, celebrating October 7th, or if it's a presidential candidate who is glorifying Hitler and preemptively blaming the Jews for his loss and trafficking in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which is a reality, and it can't be considered partisan to name that. We need to be able to call it out wherever it exists and be willing to call it out wherever it exists, and also be clear-eyed about how these different threats are manifesting on different sides of the spectrum, and in some cases removed from the spectrum. And ultimately that allows us to then, I think, stay in the coalitions we need to, because we are being truthful and realistic about that. And it allows us, frankly, to combat anti-Semitism more effectively, because we're also being truthful and realistic about what it looks like and how it manifests in different ways.
I just want to pick up a couple of things that Amy said, which everything I agree with. There's a great musician, Bernice Johnson Regan, who was part of the band Sweet Honey in the Rock. She died just a few months ago. She has this amazing speech she gives in 1981, 1982 called Coalition Politics. And she makes this, I think, really, really powerful distinction between home and coalition. And she says that everybody needs both of these things. You need home, which is where you go to be with people who agree with you, who are like you, who you share kind of perspectives and politics with, where you're comfortable and safe. And you can't stay home, because work doesn't happen at home. Work happens in coalition. Work happens with people you disagree with, who make you uncomfortable, who sometimes hurt you, but you gotta go to coalition in order to get work done. And then you gotta go home, because it's hard there. It's uncomfortable, and they piss you off a little bit, and then you gotta go home. But we've gotta live in both of those spaces, and I think we sometimes have made the mistake of mixing the two things up and thinking that coalition needs to be a place where you're comfortable, and it's not. The other thing I want to just echo is one of the kind of genius pathologies of authoritarians, or people with authoritarian tendencies, is to attack democratic norms and institutions in order to make defending them look partisan. Yep. Right? If you reject the peaceful transfer of power, or you reject the outcomes of an election, then you put people who defend those things in. You make them accusable of being partisans, of defending those things because it has partisan advantage to it. And that, I think, is not something we can kind of accede to. It's not something we can fall for. It's a trap. And that's why I think holding to the principles and not imagining that we're being partisan, I think it's really, really important to be very disciplined about that.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. And just maybe one concrete example that for me has been really clarifying. So I'm a New Yorker. Well, we're both New Yorkers. And
I'm an immigrant to New York.
And a couple months ago, I got a call from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's office. People have strong feelings about her in the Jewish community. Her office had read this report that I had put out, and they invited me to do a webinar for her followers on anti-Semitism, along with a colleague of mine. And I said yes, and then I immediately said, oh my God, am I gonna get fired for doing this? Or am I gonna get canceled for doing this? We ultimately did it. As you could imagine, we spent a lot of time, both beforehand, really seeking to understand each other, both our disagreements and where we were aligned, and then had a very frank conversation for 35 minutes where we didn't avoid the elephants in the room. We talked about Israel and Gaza. We talked about how we disagreed on parts of it. But also in this conversation, AOC very explicitly said, look, there is anti-Semitism that exists on the left. It exists in the Israel conversation. It is a threat to our progressive values and to the fight for peace. And she said this, and I think it was really the first time I heard her articulate this in such a clear way. The next day, we had this horrific anti-Semitic protest outside the Nova exhibit in New York, where, like, I'm not someone who believes that all protest of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. This was anti-Semitic. And she put out an unequivocal tweet that named it for what it was, called it anti-Semitism. And not only was that important in and of itself, but it also created the permission structure for other progressives to say the same thing, to call this out. And of course, a couple weeks later, she was unendorsed by the Democratic Socialists for doing this webinar with me and for acknowledging Israel's right to exist and the fact that anti-Semitism is a real problem. And that actually, for me, was deeply clarifying, right? How do we understand who we need to work with? Because AOC is not going anywhere. She's a very popular politician in New York. And we're going to have fundamental disagreements. And I still have disagreements with her on some of the language she uses around Israel and Gaza. And also, she named and said some very important things that fundamentally changed how progressives in New York and around the country understand and engage on anti-Semitism at a time when that's critical. And there were voices from both her left and my right who were saying, don't do this. And both of us decided to stay at the table and have this conversation despite the loud voices. And this isn't to say we're so great. It's to say that we have to, again, build that muscle to learn how to do this and recognize we're going to have deep disagreements. And the only way forward is to keep having these hard conversations and helping people understand what it means to show up as an ally to us the same way that they help us understand how to show up as an ally to them.
So I want everyone here to start to be thinking about some questions you have, some things that you feel curious about that have been said. And I want to ask, this is not fair because I didn't preview I'm going to ask this question, but I actually can't help. I can't help asking this question. That one of the continuities, it seems to me, is that a lot of money has become very, very involved in the American political system, especially since 2010 when there was an important Supreme Court case that really pulled back some of the regulations and some of the limitations on political donations. And I think that political scientists have done a pretty good job saying that that much money kind of going into the system and certain people who have that much money to be involved in the political system, it's not very good for democracy. A parallel I think we can draw is that within the Jewish community, there's a fair amount of money that is concentrated in the effort to fight or combat anti-Semitism in very particular ways that I don't think are exactly akin to how both of you are talking about anti-Semitism today. Some of them are, but some of them have become very, very entrenched in a particular advocacy for pro-Israelism, which is not to say that things that are always anti-Zionist are or are not anti-Semitic, right? But a lot of the money in the Jewish communal world now, if we tracked it, is going to organizations like the ADL and several other kind of new anti-Semitism organizations that have as their mission a kind of two-pronged approach to both fighting anti-Semitism and being organizations that have a very clear pro-Israel bent to them. And so what I'm wondering about is if in the work you're doing to think about democracy and also to think about how important democracy is to really countering anti-Semitism, if you have any kinds of ideas or perspectives on the role that money plays in all of this and sort of the changing role of money. And it's a tricky conversation. As someone who's written about philanthropy and money, I am pretty aware of how tricky it is to talk about Jews and money without actually sort of falling into certain patterns that feel anti-Semitic. So can you help us think our way through some of that?
Look, I'm going to only answer part of your question, and I'm going to do it obliquely. So first, I will say, is that a good caveat? Was that clear? Okay, cool. It is unequivocal, in my opinion, that the Citizens United decision that you talked about in 2010, Supreme Court decision that kind of opened the floodgates to money in American politics was a disaster for democracy on the order of social media, like catastrophically bad. So I think, like, I have no qualms talking about that. I'm gonna shy away from the money and anti-Semitism question. However, I'm gonna pick up on one other thing that you said, and I think probably agree with you a bit. One of the great challenges of certainly this last 12, 13 months since October 7th is a very intense indexing of American Judaism on Israel. And like our stance as an organization is that we live in an extraordinary time in Jewish history in which Jews have two civilization-level experiments happening in the world. We've never had this before. We have a sovereign state in the Middle East, and we have a population in a liberal democracy in North America. The populations are coincidentally almost exactly the same. And both of those experiments.
You mean the population size?
The population size of the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community are essentially the same. And that's like coincidentally weird. And they are unbelievably vibrant, thriving communities. We have two Jewish homelands. One of them is in the United States of America. One of them is in Israel. And both of them should succeed. I've got a very good retirement account person helping me with my retirement. He's a mutual fund guy. Like, you don't make a single bet. You bet on you have what is it, an asset allocation, right? Diversified investment strategy. It's really good for Jews to have two bets. We've never had that before. And we need to be investing, I think, deeply with money, but also with our energy and our passion in both of those things. And it's a terrible idea to throw one Jewish homeland under the bus for the sake of the other.
I so appreciate that, Freeman, because I think it's like, right, we are so often being told, and we're hearing this in a lot of the dual loyalty tropes that are coming up in our politics and in society right now, that conflating the Jewish community in Israel, the American Jewish community in Israel in particular, and so I think that clarity is really important. I guess maybe I might answer a different part of your question a little bit more directly, partially because this report that we put out, this Anti-Semitism and Democracy report, really sought to answer this question. I worked with a pretty diverse group of foundations across the sort of Jewish and democracy space, ideologically diverse, to answer how can we actually help people better understand anti-Semitism as a threat to democracy? Because the way that we are treating anti-Semitism as a Jewish community and in many other ways in the public conversation is fairly narrow, fairly siloed, and pretty particularist. We see it as this narrow, almost myopic challenge. And when in actuality, as we've been talking about here tonight, anti-Semitism is inextricably linked with our democracy, with the rights and safety of others, the way in which it's used to fuel and animate attacks on other communities and attacks on our democracy, and so too, as democracy is eroded and attacked, how it further fuels anti-Semitism. And all of the data that we've seen in recent years from the ADL, from 1-8, from others, University of Chicago has done extraordinary research on this, tells us that, for example, belief in conspiracy theories are among the best predictors of anti-Semitism, and vice versa. So too is belief in anti-Semitism one of the best predictors of propensity for political violence, and so on. You can sort of see how these dots connect. And yet we oftentimes say, well, anti-Semitism hurts Jews and Jews alone, and we're going to focus on it in this narrow, particularist way. The message research that we did as part of this report tells us not only is it true that anti-Semitism is inherently connected to threats to our democracy and all communities' safety, it's also the most effective message for engaging a lot of the communities we're often wringing our hands about right now. How do we engage young people and progressives in understanding their stake in the fight against anti-Semitism? It's helping them understand how it works to undercut our democracy and their own safety right now. And so we need to break out of this myopic, siloed way in which we talk about anti-Semitism, not only because it's factually wrong, but also because it's alienating and isolating some of the very people we need to be engaging right now. And it's hard to say, right, that it's on Jews to counter. There's a tension here, because it shouldn't be on Jews to counter anti-Semitism. But I think it is in certain ways. And frankly, we put it on ourselves by building all of this infrastructure to counter anti-Semitism. And so how we hold that tension and acknowledge that it shouldn't have to be this way, just because anti-Semitism threatens Jews should be enough. But we also know that telling this broader story is actually what's going to help keep us safer too. And it's hard to hold that. It's hard to reconcile that, but we have to.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about what both of you are saying is that, we get stuck in a kind of identity politics, right? Where the fight for to counter anti-Semitism is somehow so essential to being Jewish. And as a Jewish person, I have the right to determine what the kinds of, landscape or contours of that fight might be. And what both of you are saying, though slightly differently, I think, is that actually, this is something that is of an interest to anybody who is in this country who believes that democracy is a political form worth protecting.
Yes.
Right? And what that actually means, though, is that as Jews, we need to give up some of that kind of embeddedness of identity with this. And, if you read existential philosophers, if you read all sorts of different theories about anti-Semitism, right, one of the pieces that you learn is that part of how Jews have identified themselves is, being hated, and that, well, this is what sort of creates the community, and this is a kind of piece of identity. And this is something that is, and this is why I said at the beginning, I found this kind of really revolutionary and revelatory for me, is that it's a little bit of a release of that, and saying, you know what, this really isn't why I give money. This isn't what keeps me Jewish. This isn't why I'm going to synagogue. This fight against anti-Semitism and this sense of being the victim and being hated, that actually it's something that everybody in this country, in my civil society, needs to care about if they care about this country, if they care about this political system existing. And I think if people really listen to what you're saying, there is a kind of radical critique of how a lot of Jewish communal politics have operated. And, to the extent you want to say it, or it's not really at the core of how you're, kind of strategically locating your organizations, that's fine. I get to be sort of sitting on the outside and telling you this is what I'm seeing. But I hope that, we kind of take to heart that this also opens up a way of entering into relationships with people who don't have to necessarily think about being Jewish or think about our identities or even think about anti-Semitism or think about Israel in exactly the same way, right? This creates a different kind of common ground, right?
And I would also say, particularly in a post-October 7th world, it's so, right, the loudest voices are isolating us and making us feel alone. And we are all, rightfully so, in deep pain and grief, and we're still in trauma because there's hostages that remain, the war is ongoing, there are innocent Palestinians being killed, and now people in Lebanon and the front opening up with Iran. There's so much that we're still in trauma around. And what we can't lose sight of in this moment is also Jewish pride and joy and all of the proactive, constructive things that make us Jewish. We can't define ourselves simply by the trauma and the pain. But that has been such a big part of our own identity, not just in the last year, but throughout history, as we've been talking about. And so I think how we not lose sight of that Jewish joy and pride right now, my rabbi, our rabbi in Brooklyn, there was a story in JTA about how sort of in an Oprah-like moment, she gave out Star of David necklaces during her Rosh Hashanah service. And I deeply appreciate it. I was already wearing mine that I sort of put back on after October 7th, frankly, alongside my Holocaust survivor grandmother's necklace that I was always wearing. But right, like how do we not just sit in this trauma and the fear and the pain, but really embrace what it means to be Jewish in this proactive way? And frankly, I think it ties directly to this conversation around democracy, right? What are we doing in this moment? We are not putting up walls. We are actually going out there and engaging civically and canvassing and working the polls and curing ballots and doing all of the things that we need to do because our values tell us we need to do this as Jews, not just because we're scared right now.
So I want to invite you, the audience, to join this conversation in a number of ways. So the first two ways I will say is that both Amy and Aaron have worked on phenomenal reports. One is, I think, called a report. One is called a white paper. And the one that Amy wrote is called Anti-Semitism and Democracy, and you can find it on the JCPA website. Aaron worked on a white paper that's called A More Perfect Union, from 2023, and you can find it also on their website. And I really encourage you to read these texts. If you're looking totally to take your mind off of the situation right now, get a massage, as some people suggested. But if you're looking for something that offers you some new perspective, I really, really encourage you to read these texts. And then I want to invite you now to ask some questions And to, what I always try to say is really to foreground the curiosity and the question. A lot of us enter this space with, some preconceived ideas, which is great, but I invite you to really think about how are your ideas changing or responding in light of this conversation, and what else do you want to know? Do you want water? Okay. Yeah, no, I'm okay.
Thank you. The question I have, a lot of the discussion about anti-Semitism in the past year has to do with the legislation that's been passed about anti-Semitism. How effective do you think a definition from the federal government would be to, I guess, assist in state and local governments in dealing with it? And sort of a tertiary question to that is, I'm a teacher in Philadelphia. There's a lawsuit currently in the school district of Philadelphia about anti-Semitism. How effective would that legislation be to set guardrails to give guidance to school districts about how to best address issues of anti-Semitism?
That's all you.
Me. So this is, look, the definition fight has been like the fight in the Jewish community in certain ways, particularly if you are following inside DC or inside state capitol baseball. Here's the perspective that we take at JCPA. We think having a definition is a crucial resource. It should not be codified into law. And that is the distinction. So we at JCPA, a number of years ago, adopted the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition, as a resource, saying that this is a good framework to understand anti-Semitism. The White House strategy to counter anti-Semitism, which came out last year, and I think is truly a remarkable document, and I would add it to the list of things people should check out, I think really navigates this quite well. It says IRA is a crucial resource. It also points to some other things like the nexus definition, not because they're necessarily in conflict with one another, but because in certain circumstances, there are actually parts of the nexus definition that more directly answer some of the questions that IRA doesn't. Where I have challenges and where I think a lot of civil liberties and civil rights partners and activists have had challenges is when these definitions are codified into law. And it in turn leads to questions about sort of criminalizing certain speech or other behavior that raises, I think, frankly, a lot of democratic concerns. And so how we distinguish between that is the big debate right now. And frankly, on the national level, this is happening. So there's a bill called the Countering Anti-Semitism Act, which we at JCPA strongly support. We organized a coalition of 61 Jewish organizations from AIPAC and ZOA on one side to J Street and other progressive groups on the other in support of this bill, saying that this bill would put real resources behind the White House strategy. It would do a number of things to actually put teeth into the fight against anti-Semitism. There's broad communal support for that. And then there's another bill called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act that's more narrowly focused on a definition that we have not been engaged on, and we specifically don't take a position on because some of our partners are supporting it, some of our partners are opposing it. And it's really, right, it's the fact that I think we are spending so much time and energy on some of these definitional questions can sometimes be used by certain voices to distract from what we actually need to do to counter anti-Semitism. So how we can both understand that we need language and we need definitions as resources and tools, but also not let it become the entire fight so that we are not actually holding our elected officials and others accountable for putting real resources into things like the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Ed, which is what holds schools accountable for assaults on students' civil rights, including Jewish students and Muslim students and LGBTQ students and others, right? Right now there are 50 cases per caseworker at this office. When we're wringing our hands about campus anti-Semitism and we're cutting funding to the very office intended to counter it, passing a definition is not necessarily going to be as effective as putting real money into that office so that schools are held accountable and students are kept safe. And so we need to right-size these conversations in certain ways and not lose sight of the importance of these definitions and the roles that they play in the conversation, but also not let them become this red herring that distracts from the broader tools and resources we need to actually counter anti-Semitism in a holistic, whole of government, whole of society way.
Thank you. Anytime some incident occurs, I feel like we hear that we need to combat anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and I feel like sometimes that is used to shut down the fight against anti-Semitism, and I'm wondering what it actually looks like in practice in the work that you're doing to combat both of those hand in hand.
Me. That's-
You again? All good.
I'm sure you have thoughts on these.
I do.
Look, we need to call it out where it exists, right? So in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, we saw both a horrific spike in anti-Semitism and a horrific spike in Islamophobic and anti-Arab hate. And so, I think certainly we in the Jewish community named the anti-Semitism very quickly. There were some who did name it, and a lot of potential partners and allies who did not name it as quickly as some of us would have liked. I think it's a lot more complicated than some of the narratives have suggested, that no one showed up for us. Some of the first calls I got were from Black civil rights leaders and others who were naming those celebrating October 7th as really beyond the pale and causing harm. And also we saw within days of October 7th, violence targeting Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, including the murder of a 6-year-old Muslim Palestinian American child in Chicago, and a violent assault against 3 Palestinian American students who are in Vermont. And so we at JCPA specifically organized a statement of, I think, over 160 Jewish organizations nationally and locally saying, obviously we're concerned about anti-Semitism right now, but that doesn't take away from the fact that we need to call out and wholeheartedly reject Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate in this moment, basically not in our name. And that in many ways, frankly, opened up the door for some of the conversations that were really hard to have in those initial weeks after October 7th. We heard from Jewish Community Relations Council directors and others who we work with around the country that statement allowed them to actually have some of those initial conversations with their local partners in the Muslim and Arab American communities who were also in a lot of deep pain and fear. And so we can call it out where it exists without needing to both sides it in the specific instances where something is happening. Sometimes it's important to just say, this is anti-Semitism, and we don't need to say, and it exists alongside all these other forms of hate. But we can also help people understand, as we've been talking about, why it actually fundamentally threatens them as well when anti-Semitism is allowed to fester. And so too can we call out Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate as Jews, and it doesn't take away from our own fight against anti-Semitism. There's we treat this as if there's a limited piece of the pie, but there's enough pie to go around. And in fact, by keeping all of us safe and countering hate in every form, we are fundamentally protecting ourselves. And I think that statement that we put out on Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate was in many ways about Jewish safety inherently as it was about the safety of our neighbors, because it's all intertwined.
Yeah, so I was really interested in your definition about Jewish identity. On the one hand, saying that our identity is sometimes as victim and other times as, I think your words were, pride and joy, right? So don't you think that when you're making coalition building, we bring all of those identities simultaneously to bear? Do we really want to leave part of our identities behind in order to engage in coalition building? And along with that, my question is, aren't there some coalitions where we would like to participate and bring all of ourselves to it, but our partners, our hoped-for partners, don't want to go there with us? And I see it in academia, and I see it in the very groups you were talking about, anti-racial, social justice groups. So how do you navigate that?
I think, of course, we should bring all of our identities with us. I think that's, we are whole people, and that's part of the power of living in a democracy, is that we get to be the whole people that we are. We can't force ourselves on coalitions that don't want us, but I think we can call out when people are being exclusionary based on identity. We shouldn't do it ourselves, and we should call it out based again on I think some principles that we commit to, so that we're naming the thing not as a partisan act, but as a principled commitment, and then we stick to our guns.
I totally agree. And I think we've got to bring all of the identity with us. And I think specifically to your question about coalitions, it's far more complicated than I think some of the narrative has been, right? There's been this narrative that these progressive or social justice coalitions have wholeheartedly rejected Jews. And I don't think that's actually the reality. Many of the coalitions we're in, things like the Leadership Conference for Civil Rights, which JCPA helped founded, we've worked very hard behind the scenes to keep it together in the last year, but we have. And that matters right now. And there are absolutely those spaces, including in academia and in artistic and literary communities, where they've said ban all Zionists. And part of the hard work right now is helping people even understand what this language means, right? Helping people understand what the term Zionist might mean to me as someone who, is progressive Zionist, believes Israel should exist, believes it needs to be a democracy, has deep concerns about the Israeli government and the occupation of the West Bank, and so on and so on. And how we help people understand that, how they understand the term Zionist might be different than how the 80 to 90% of American Jews who have a relationship with Israel and have that connection with Israel define it. And therefore, when you say ban and boycott Zionists, you're effectively saying ban and boycott 80 to 90% of American Jews who have some sort of relationship there, and how that affects, right? But you can't do that in a tweet. You can't do that in a soundbite. It takes the hard work of sitting down at these tables and having these conversations. And that's why I think we refuse to walk away. There are always going to be those times where we do have to walk away because someone has done something so painful and harmful. But we need to start by trying to help people understand and speak the same language.
Can I just name a little bit more tension than I'm hearing either of you address, which is that there is something complicated about part of what American Jews claim to be their identity also being a political question. And how do you think about the ability to navigate political conversations, which in a democracy, like Aaron, you made a very convincing case, that we need to be allowed to have deep, vehement political disagreements and protest each other's politics. And that doesn't mean that therefore I get to say, you can't come into this space with me, right? So how do we deal with the fact that a constituent piece of many Jews' identities, especially demographically as you get to older ages, right, is tied to something that is also a very contentious political issue, right? I mean, I think it's a kind of more complicated question than just, you show up as you are and you name these issues and whatever, right? So I want you to solve this.
If we could solve this, we would have solved American Jewish
Yeah, right? Like, in a way, I don't want to take the bait. I don't know that it's more complicated. I think you've got to call it out. We don't
What's
get
the
to
it?
You've got to call out when people are being exclusionary based on identity, right? When people say no allowed here, you need to name that as a violation of fundamental democratic principles, right? Because identity, part of what makes democracy similar to Judaism, is a fundamental endowing of human beings with inherent dignity, worth, and agency, right? Like, so there's kind of interesting like synchronicity between the two things. Like, when that's being violated, you need to call it out. We don't get to make each other do stuff in a democracy. We shouldn't be able to make each other do stuff. If we're starting to make each other do stuff, we're not really in a democracy anymore. Things that violate their agency. So I think we call it out and hope that we carry the day. And if we don't, we're in a much darker place.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also like multiple things are true at the same time. 80 to 90% of Jews have a connection to Israel, identify as a Zionist, whatever terminology we want to use, right? Like, polling Jews is very hard. There's been a Pew poll because there's so few of us, and so you only get a good Jewish poll every decade or so. But the most recent one basically says that 80 to 90% of Jews have a connection to Israel, which I'm using as my baseline here. But also, if you look at what Jews are saying we're voting on, Israel is like 9th, 10th on the list. We're voting on democracy. We're voting on healthcare, education, abortion right now. The economy, right? And so how we actually acknowledge this tension, but also not let it become, right? Donald Trump telling Jews that we are all out of our minds because we're both one and the same with Israel and we're not going to vote for him. We're disloyal to Israel and we're disloyal to him is actually, right, like that plays right into these dual loyalty tropes that conflate the Jewish community in Israel that then lead to a lot of the tensions that we're talking about in all different directions. And so how we both hold and not give up our connection to Israel for those of us that have it, which is the majority of us who do, but also sort of right size it in the context of all of the other issues we care about, because again, as Aaron said, in a democracy, we are all entitled to our beliefs and to what matters. And if we don't have that, if we're not voting on democracy, we're not going to have the ability to advocate for Israel or frankly for anything else.
Thank you for an insightful and very intelligent discussion. Been really a pleasure to listen to you. There's an aspect of the threat to democracy that I haven't heard anything about yet, though. That is Christian nationalism. So I think that it's not democracy that really is our protector. It's American democracy.
Agreed.
Excuse me. So can you weave that into the discussion in any way with any thoughts or insights, please?
Go for it.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think in some ways, what started as sort of white supremacy and what we saw in Charlottesville was in many ways some of the precursor to the really normalized white Christian nationalism that we're seeing. And this, how it's moved from the fringes, neo-Nazis with torches, or a white supremacist in Pittsburgh, or in Buffalo and El Paso, has now really become normalized in our politics, and we're particularly seeing it in things like Project 2025, and we see how inherent to this white Christian nationalism are a lot of these very same conspiracy theories and tropes that we've been talking about here, right? The attacks on abortion rights and how those are how fundamental conspiracy theories related to birth rates go back to a lot of the same replacement language and other tropes and conspiracies we're talking about. How neo-Nazis, for example, are recruiting off of anti-LGBTQ and anti-drag events that are oftentimes being led by white Christian nationalists. How this deep interconnection between these white Christian nationalist politics that target so many different communities are fundamentally rooted in these conspiracy theories. And ultimately, if you look at Project 2025 and some of these other sort of documented white Christian nationalist propaganda, I would argue at this point, they're about how we blow up the separation of church and state, which is at the core of our democracy and which has been at the core of what has made Jews safe here and allowed us to thrive for so long. And so we need to be clear-eyed about it, and we need to be clear-eyed about the fact that it is directly connected to the more explicit and vile conspiracy theories that are easier for us to understand when they're extremists with torches or, God forbid, a gun or something like that, and how these normalized, dehumanizing policies targeting the LGBTQ community or abortion rights or immigrants or so many others are fundamentally rooted in these same ideas and are built on this foundation of white Christian nationalism intended to make this a Christian country and give up the very freedoms and separation of church and state that has been inherent to Jewish safety. So while we might not have named it, I think it's so woven into so much of this conversation because it is at the core of a lot of the anti-democratic extremism we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll add to that, and I think Amy totally nails it, is I think a lot of this conversation has been focused on the ways that anti-Semitism represents a threat to Jews, and how do we tackle that thing? And our organization comes at it indirectly, right? We're not in the fighting anti-Semitism business. We're in the preserving democracy because it's the best place for Jews. White Christian nationalism represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what American democracy is and is about. And it's actually a big project. It's a hard project to get American Jewish institutions to think of themselves as dependent on and contributors to American democracy. I've been talking a lot about principles. I'll just share this little tidbit for you. We launched a set of democracy principles about 2 weeks ago. We had an op-ed in EJP, and we shared a set of 6 democracy principles. We modeled them after the democracy principles that this conservative legal group called the Society for the Rule of Law launched over the summer. They were trying to get out ahead of the Rudy Giuliani shenanigans that happened in 2020 and remind lawyers that their duty is to the rule of law, not to their clients if their clients are trying to subvert it. So we're okay, great, let's get Jewish institutions, leaders of Jewish civil society institutions, to sign on to a similar set of principles. Not crazy stuff, things like we want free and fair elections. We want to defend freedom of speech and of the press and freedom to assemble. We want to defend the rule of law, right? So we put these things out. 80 organizations signed up right away, and I can't tell you how many Jewish institutions have said, can't sign those. There's a presidential candidate who hasn't renounced violence and who hasn't committed to respecting the outcomes of the election, so if I sign on to them, I'm being partisan. Or, and it's more complicated, I want to be respectful, signing on to protect freedom of speech right now is giving aid and comfort to people who are using speech in anti-Semitic ways. Or, here it gets even more complicated, in your principles, Aaron, you call out defending the US Constitution, and I, as a black woman, read the US Constitution as a racist document. Complicated, complicated. And yet, the number of organizations that have refused to sign on to them for, like, reasons that are, I think, disquieting in advance of an election, God knows they're never gonna sign on to them after the election, like, is nervous-making to me.
That is sobering. So I think we have time for, if there's like one more question, if anybody has. I haven't been monitoring who.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I was
Let's
going
do
to.
it.
Yes, yes. So this is what I want you to tell us. What is it that you hold on to that gives you a sense of real hope about the work that you're doing, right? Like, so is it a practice we can do? Is it, something that you've seen that's really a victory, right? What is it that you hold on to that really gives you hope that the struggle that you're engaged in is meaningful and is leading to us to a better place?
Do you want me to? I'll go first.
Go for it.
Okay. Look, honestly, I honestly genuinely believe there are many reasons for hope right now. And I think it's hard to feel hope, particularly because the loudest voices are telling us not to. They're trying to isolate us. And this is true in all different directions, whether it was pre-October 7th or post-October 7th. It's a really hard and painful and isolating time to be a Jew, to be anyone who cares about democracy, to be an American. We're forgetting the fact that on top of everything we've talked about here tonight, we're coming out of a global pandemic and all of the isolation and pain that came with that. There's so much that we've gone through as a community, as a broader society, and as a democracy, and we need to recognize that pain and trauma as we've been talking about. But I also think that genuinely there are very good reasons for hope, and one of the things that I hold on to is what happened in our Charlottesville trial. We brought this lawsuit against the 24 neo-Nazis and white supremacists that orchestrated the violence, names and organizations I'm sure many of you know, like Richard Spencer and the KKK and others. A long road to trial because Nazis are not the easiest of defendants. Every excuse was like the dog ate my homework of Nazi defenses, and then we layer a pandemic on top of that. But we finally got to trial in fall of 2021. And the jury was not, the most progressive liberal jury. The Western District of Virginia, the federal court where we went to trial, is not, besides for maybe the city of Charlottesville, is not considered the most liberal place. And if you drive through there, including I was there a few weeks ago, there's a lot of Trump signs up. There's a number of Harris signs up too, but it's not a liberal place. And there was real anxiety among our team, our plaintiffs, about whether this jury would actually see through that attempt to desensitize them to hate. As I mentioned earlier, very explicit, deliberate efforts to desensitize the jury to bigotry, to anti-Semitism, to racism. And to really muddy the waters. And this jury, despite those really direct efforts, wholly rejected the hate and the extremism that was on display. They said that sort of hate and violence has no place in our society. They found every defendant liable to the tune of $26 million, unequivocally. And that matters, right? That matters at a time when we're told there aren't consequences for hatred and bigotry. We're living in a time when it's hard to believe that there are actually consequences, and we need to fight like crazy to protect our democracy and make sure the rule of law holds so that there are consequences. But there are reasons for hope, and we need to keep finding them and advancing them and telling these stories, because it's the isolation and the depression and the lack of hope that are core tactics of extremists to make us feel like we're powerless right now, and we are really not. There is so much we can do, both in the next 2 weeks, but perhaps even more importantly, every week thereafter.
Love that. I'll say 2 things, maybe a third. The author and historian Jill Lepore wrote an article in The New Yorker maybe 4 or 5 years ago called "The Last Time Democracy Almost Died." And she was writing about the kind of national flirtation with fascism that we had in this country in the 1930s, with Father Coughlin on the radio and Charles Lindbergh doing America First the first time, and like a real kind of infatuation with Hitler. And one of her like kind of crazy claim is that the reason democracy won in the 1930s is because we studied it. We had book groups, right? Like W.E.B. Du Bois did radio lectures on the Federalist Papers, and E.B. White published essays in the New York Times that people sat around in like Chautauqua groups and discussed democracy, and like that's what this is. Right, like you all came out on a Tuesday night to talk about democracy, and the same thing is happening in, I spoke to a group in Kentucky a few weeks ago and a group in Wisconsin a few weeks before that, and people on Long Island. There's like a fierce interest in and commitment to trying to understand, like, what is this democracy thing? We kind of were inured to it and took it for granted, but like it needs us in order to deliver for us what we need from it. So I think that's one thing that gives me hope. The other thing is, my wife has this great line she shared with me a couple years ago. She said, people have a hard time loving things that are broken. Loving things that are broken. And I think that's true. I think that's like fundamentally true. And her observation was that oftentimes people on the left look at America and they see all the things about it that are broken. And where they land is, oh man, it's really broken, I don't think I can love it. And people on the right who share this struggle with loving broken things, they love America, and so they can't acknowledge the things about it that are broken. Like, oh, must not be broken, because I love it. And I think that there's a lane there for us about embracing loving things that are broken, because the truth is, like, we kind of all are. America is. Another way that it's similar to Judaism, kind of broken. We have this practice at the end of the Passover Seder of saying Bashana haba Abba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. They even say it in Jerusalem. Right? Because Judaism, like democracy, isn't about like arriving in a place, it's about aspiring to it. One of the kooky things about my organization's name, A More Perfect Union, is that it's not grammatically sound. Something can't be more perfect. Perfect is a non-modifiable adjective, like unique. You can't be more unique. You can either be unique or not unique. You can either be perfect or not, but it contains within it some quality of aspiration. And to me, that's an edge of hope. That's a source of hope.
So what you're hearing actually is you all give us hope. You all should give one another hope that we're coming out, that we're having these conversations, and multiply these conversations, right? Go home, have them with other people, read the beautiful and profound words of Amy's organization, and that Amy really put together, and Aaron and his organization, and that he put together. And let's keep studying these things together, as if they are something that if we can't make them perfect, we can make them more perfect. So, thank you.
So, thank you very much. I want to thank, again, the Sellers Fund for supporting this amazing event and wonderful discussion. I just want to mention Rodef Shalom did sign your principles. So there you go. So two things, when we try to do things at Rodef Shalom, we always try to leave you with some action items, things you can do. So number one, I can tell you we here at Rodef Shalom are giving our staff off part of the day on election day so they can get out and vote. So to the extent that you have some influence in your lives, right? So folks in your offices or people you know who work in offices still can get some time off or ask for that time off, you should really do that. It's really important to vote. And then related to that, Lisa Cagle, who is one of our leaders for RAC PA and our voting initiative, can tell you about a couple of things we have coming up here in the near future in the next 2 weeks where you can also help. Here you go, Lisa.
So first, I just want to thank everybody who has participated in our postcard parties. We've gotten so many postcards out, and we're really grateful to all of you for doing that. So running through the election, we're going to have an in-person phone banking event next Tuesday night here from 6 to 8 in partnership with RAC PA. We would love for you to join us in person. bring your phone and a laptop or a tablet, and we will be participating with other members of RAC PA. There are also other phone banking events happening that you can participate in virtually. So if you go to rac.org/PA, on the homepage, you'll see a bunch of additional phone banking events that you can sign up for. RAC PA is also participating in the Faith Election Sabotage Network. And so they're going to be telling us what we can do if we need to participate in trying to make sure that there isn't election sabotage. And they're planning now, they're doing scenario planning, and I know Rabbi Friedman has been involved in that network as well. So I hope that you will choose to participate in at least one of these things. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming. You've got your program for our future Broad Perspective programs. We hope to see you out here as well. Good night.